It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight, and I will also want to do the acknowledgement of country. So Monash University's Australian campuses are proudly on Kulin land in Melbourne. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and recognise and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And so it is with the greatest of pleasure that I actually get to introduce Jeff Brooks to us. Now, you'll find out when he opens his mouth that he's not Australian. Yes, I know. So he's recently come to us from the USA, born, I love saying all of this, born in Memphis, Tennessee, but grew up in Columbia, in Missouri. And so you'll notice the accent when he opens his mouth. And so I decided that I'd Google Jeff to see what, it was publicly out there. So I thought this line really struck me. So this is Jeff talking about himself. I believe that high quality research, culturally relevant teaching and proactive leadership for social justice can improve children's lives and educational experiences. And to me, nothing is more important. So that might give you a sense of what he's about to talk about. But I'd also just like to say a big welcome to Jeff, because on entry into the country, it wasn't so welcoming. So Jeff's first day or two in Melbourne as he arrived in the heat after coming from the cold in the US was he'd decided he needed a mobile phone. So he's braved Chadstone at Christmas or New Year's sales, which is very brave in itself. Now, Jeff has a wife, 3 daughters and a son. And so he took the whole family to Chatty, and his son is little, 5. And guess what? They're in the Telstra shop, and as young boys are, larking about on the stool in the Telstra shop, falls over, breaks his nose. So talk about leadership. Right, had so many strategies that actually got into Monash Medical Centre at Clayton with a child with a broken nose, as well as the rest of the family, and negotiated Chadstone at New Year's sales. So, I think that's pretty great credentials in terms of leadership strategies. So, Jeff, welcome to Australia. Hopefully this is a better welcome. Yeah. Without too many incidents, and we look forward to your talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some questions after that. Okay, so Jeff, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, the funny thing about the accent is that I actually come from a part of the United States that's famous for having the most neutral accent. I know that's hard to believe, but a lot of the newscasters come from my part of the country because we supposedly have the flattest accent in the United States. So take that for what you will. And all right, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for coming, for braving the elements to be with us tonight and to listen to a couple of things that I'm going to talk about. The first thing I want to say is that I want to talk about what this lecture is and what it isn't. The purpose of this is to share both a work in progress. This is actually sort of the bones of a chapter I'm writing with a colleague of mine, Catherine Lugg, for actually a book that's Gabrielle Chomsky and some other people, Australian scholars, are putting together. It's also to be able to share some ideas, some problems, and some questions that have come up to me during the 15 years that I've been working on educational leadership as a scholar. So what I'm going to do, I'm not really going to describe to you a single project as such, but what I'm going to do is kind of share with you a bit of a critical interrogation of where the field is and where it might be going in the future. I'm also going to try to think about a little bit during this and speak to some different ideas that might help us moving forward. I want to say too, a bit of a caveat here. Well, I'm going to say some things that are very critical of the field of educational leadership in particular. I also share in them. While I'm pointing one finger this way, there are 3 coming back at me. These are critiques that I'd also level at my own work. I'm just at a crossroads in trying to move things forward and try to get us moving towards some of the most important things that educational leaders, both practicing and in terms of scholarship, should be thinking about and trying to answer. So over these 15 years that I've been doing this kind of work, the research and practice of educational leadership has changed quite a bit. Some of that's been drastic, as things are. It really works much like what we might call a punctuated equilibrium. Many of the things that are happening in the field are steady, improving, changing things that have happened over a long period of time. And others come in a big spike, new legislation, a new government, new policies, all of those kinds of things, new research that helps us rethink the way we're doing things in schools. And so I just noted a couple of things here just to help frame it for some of you who don't particularly study or practice educational leadership. But we've seen over the last 2 decades in particular a real rise in both the use and misuse of accountability in schools. We've seen testing used for purposes it was never meant to be used for. We've seen also, though, we've seen some positive things come out of the accountability movement, just in terms of being able to share best practices at a higher level, having stronger research bases for a lot of the things we're doing. It's really opened up a lot of things that were previously closed. So it's not all bad, I would say, although there's a lot of questionable stuff going on. There's been increased scrutiny on the way leaders are prepared, the way they practice, and the kinds of research that we conduct to try to understand what they do and to improve their practice. So this has come in the form of many large-scale critiques, many meta-analyses have been done in the last 10 years or so, especially to say, what do we really know about education leadership? What do we not know? What works? What doesn't work? All of those kinds of things have been in play. There's also been an increased acknowledgement that we shouldn't anymore just be talking about educational administration. If you were in the field, say 40 years ago or so, you would have only talked about educational administration, not leadership quite as much. Even though probably a lot of what was happening was leadership, just called something different. We've come to understand that administration, management, and leadership all play key roles in moving schools forward and helping them be efficient, equitable, and excellent places for students to learn and teachers to practice. Now, there are also some sort of classic tensions that have been exacerbated because of different kinds of policy, research, changes to practice. Some of those tensions have to do with the amount of freedom versus the amount of control that are in schools. The level of agency that educational leaders have mean that they're able to influence each of these dynamics. We also have issues around equity and equality. I'll speak a bit about that more later. We also have one of the classic kind of tensions in the field has to do with the difference between how much leadership activity is directive versus being supportive, which is usually thought of as something that's in balance. We also want to think about things like coercion and cooperation, which really takes on something key now that we're in an accountability era, and also in an era where schools in many ways are competing with each other. We also have the classic issue of individualization versus standardization. And that has to do both with the way that leadership is practiced, the way that people are evaluated, the way schools are assessed, the way we think about improvement, and all of those kinds of things. So I'm going to touch on some of these here in this discussion. Just so to follow up on what Deb was saying a minute ago, most of my research has been empirical research that looks at issues related to social justice and equity. I've written a lot about racism, sexism, different kinds of things, and the way that school leaders are influenced by those things and the way that they're able to influence those things positively and or negatively in some kind of cases. So just to give you a little bit of a frame of where I'm coming from, I would position myself probably as a critical scholar who does a lot of social justice research. One of my great inspirations as a scholar has been the work of Noam Chomsky, who some of you may be familiar with. This is one of his greatest quotes that I was introduced to actually early as a graduate student, and it's something that's stuck with me the whole time I've been doing this kind of work. And that's that it's really incumbent on us as scholars, as educators, as leaders, to be questioning the foundations of what we're doing, to be constantly critically reflecting in our practice, and especially in an era where you're asked to be accountable, where everything is counted, where things are trying to be quantified. It's really important that we take a step back and we question the foundations and assumptions of some of the things that we're doing, lest we lose our perspective on what it is we're really here to do. So this presentation, some of the things I'm going to say in it, is delivered in that spirit, that I'm questioning some of the basic things about the field. That's where the name of the presentation comes from. It's a questioning, is everything we know about educational leadership wrong? Because one of the questions that you'll see that becomes a refrain through this presentation is, have we got it all wrong from the beginning? Have we misconceptualized the whole thing and then built on a foundation that wasn't quite where it needs to be? One of the first points I want to make with regard to that topic has to do with educational leadership theories. They often do not include or connect in any way to student learning processes or outcomes, and they only have a tenuous connection to teaching. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, if we think of educational leadership as a field, it tends to be very strong on leadership and very weak on education. We're very good at developing organizational theories. We're very good at borrowing theories from a few from the social sciences, but many from business and other kinds of places. But we're not really good at making sure that what we're doing is telling us something deep and meaningful about learning or teaching. That said, it seems obvious that students and student learning should be central to educational leadership theories, not marginalized or treated as a contextual or latent variable. And that's one of the things that you see a lot in educational leadership research, is you read this wonderful stuff that's telling you about how teachers work together and about how the organization is structured, about how practice has changed. And the one thing you'll notice that you don't see hardly at all is anything that relates to actual teaching or learning or the things that make educational institutions special and unique. Now, that said, when you do see learning discussed in educational leadership research, what you tend to see is you tend to see it talked about in terms of standardized test scores, aggregate, or sometimes even mined down to the classroom level or with different types of subgroups. But that's a very unsatisfying proxy for many reasons. One of the most central being that we don't know if school leaders actually have a direct effect on student learning. That's one of the biggest debates in the field right now. There's a camp that says that they only have indirect effects on it, and a camp that says they have direct effects. It's certainly not substantiated beyond a reasonable doubt. So one of the things we need, and then I'll talk about a little bit more later, is that we need to be pushing our ideas about what learning is and how it's assessed and how it's measured beyond standardized testing. Schools are so rich with data about what students are learning. You just walk into any classroom, look at the portfolios that teachers have that show growth over the course of a year or a couple of years, different kinds of assignments. There's so many ways we could be doing it, but in educational leadership research, we don't tend to pay attention to any of that. What we do, and has happened in the field a lot, is that we've come up with these terms that sound like it relates to learning, but it really doesn't relate to learning. We talk a lot about organizational learning, and we talk about things like professional learning teams or professional learning communities. Well, what those really are is those have to do with efficiency. Those don't have to do with learning and teaching. They sometimes are a conduit toward ideas flowing here and there, but when you see it, if you pay attention to it in the leadership literature, what you're going to see is something that's really about the organization of teachers and changing who talks to whom in a school. It's really not about student learning and not even about educator learning, except maybe in a very oblique kind of way. Now, as an example of this, I want to just illustrate this by using one of the most important theories that's come into the educational leadership field in the last 30 years, and that's distributed leadership. Has anybody in the room heard of distributed leadership? Okay. Yeah, it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. But just for everybody, just in general, what distributed leadership is all about is it says that basically leadership isn't something that one person practices. Leadership is something that happens between people, okay? That may sound obvious, but bear with me for a minute. And what they'll tell us in distributed leadership is that there's basically a triangle. So things happen between leaders and followers in specific situations, and we call that leadership practice. Now, the reason that triangle is repeated is because what distributed leadership tells us, which has been a great insight and very helpful for the field, is that that practice changes and is fluid over time. That some people, that given the situation, people become leaders and people become followers, and we don't have to think about schools in that traditional hierarchy that this person's a leader and that person's a follower. Because in a school that's functioning properly, depending on the expertise, depending on the situation, depending on the knowledge, leaders are going to emerge and help move the school forward in different ways. And that evolves over time. Okay, is everybody with me? Okay. Now, are there any words or terms or concepts that you see missing in this diagram? What's that? Students. Any others? Teachers. Learning. Progress. Yeah. I'm with you. And so when I look at this, I think, wow, this is a great organizational theory. It's not an educational theory as such. Here's what it might look like. And this is just playing with it and putting student learning at the center of it, okay? Now, this reconceptualization of it puts it in relation to a specific area of content knowledge, and you might even add to that and say like primary or secondary science or in relation to a specific topic. But what that's done, I'm sorry the print is so small, but what you have is you have leadership, followership, and situations and context, the same triangle that we had in the last diagram, but what's in the center? Student learning. It changes the focus. And then what this notices also is that leadership is distributed in the manner that I just explained a minute ago, but it's also differentiated. People have different skills, they have different talents, and there are certain areas of practice where certain people are never going to lead and others will always be the leader, okay? And that's differentiation, not exactly distribution the way they're talking about it. This also acknowledges that it's a dynamic, these ideas are dynamic. They're constantly changing, everything is in motion, it's not static. So basically what you've got, and this isn't even going as far as I'd like to suggest. This is just one step further than the last model that I showed you. But the point being that we need to start thinking about educational leadership as something that supports student learning, that supports good instruction, all of those things. Not that's just an organizational theory and we use that to tell us something about the way schools work. We've got to push on and connect it to learning and different ways of thinking about learning and the way things develop. The next point that I want to make has to do with the danger of thinking that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to educational leadership. I don't know if you can see this very well. It's a cartoon that's pretty widely used, and it just, so you've got saying that everybody's got to climb the tree, that's a fair exam. You got everything from an elephant to a fish in a bowl to a monkey to every kinds of several other animals. So obviously just illustrating that people come to these things with different talents, with different abilities, and the assessments that we use for them aren't always individualized enough to actually tell us something about what their abilities might be. So one of the things, the tensions, and especially in the last 10 years this has come to the fore, is that there's a real drive toward generalizability and standardization of education leadership ideas and practices. The idea that, oh, these are the 10 things that successful leaders do. You do it, and you do it, and you do it, and you do it, and we're going to have all these successful schools. Anybody who spends about 10 minutes in a school knows that those factors are configured completely different in every school and in every classroom, and even often for every subgroup within the school, and we could go on and on and on. These things are much more fluid. That kind of research is very helpful in identifying some basic underlying factors that might help us form a foundation for practice, but it can never actually dictate to us or help us come up with sort of a prescriptive approach to educational leadership. It's always fluid, it's always dynamic. So as such, professional standards, which I know have been quite in the discussion in Australia over the last several years, can only be a starting point for the way that we think about educational leadership. And even going further than that, there's a real danger, and this is one of the things that's happened in the United States that I would just say is a cautionary tale for Australia, is that scholars have let the standards frame the knowledge of the field. This is a very dangerous trend, meaning that they'll say, oh, okay, as my way for looking at leadership practice is based around the ISLIC. ISLIC is our big standards for educational leaders that we use in the United States. So these 8 things are what I went into the school looking for, and that's it, and it told me this about leadership practice, and yada, 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 yada. Now that's partially because that's where the funding is, I guess, but when you restrict the way that we think about education, when you restrict the way that we think about schools, and you start looking at those standards, for example, the ISLIC standards, the one we have in the United States, have nothing about social justice, they have nothing about equity, and we have one of the most inequitable schooling systems the world's ever seen in the United States. And so if we're creating these ways of thinking about the field, we've got to be, especially as scholars, but also as practitioners, we have to be critical of the perspectives that people are giving to us and make sure that we're bringing our own views to things and interrogating them as we move forward. It's also important to remember, I just lost the screen I was looking at. It's also to remember that it's important to keep in mind that all of these things are fluid. They all change over time. Leaders change, teachers change, students develop, all these things happen. There's also quite a lot we know with how much is teacher turnover an issue in schools? Administrator attrition, people moving, especially in a place like Melbourne where you have a high immigrant population, one of the highest in the world. You're in constant flux. People are moving in, people are moving out, and things are always in motion. So we can't take a static view of what leadership means. It's constantly moving, it's constantly dynamic. One of the things that's happened with standardization too is have any of you in this room ever heard anybody say, well, that's the way we do things at this school, and if you don't like it, you can get out? Yeah, that's lazy, it's unethical, and it's not student-centered in any way. Because one of the things that we've got to push away from is making sure that what we're doing is in leadership positions is not leading by threat, leading by what's called power over types of ways of approaching things. And school leaders who walk into it and think, there is one good way to teach, there is one way that we're going to do this, there's one way we're going to do that, are missing the boat. I'll talk about this a little bit, well, I'll save that point for just a minute. But you've got to understand that when you hear someone say that, unless the thing that's causing the person to tell you to move on is something seriously detrimental to the kids, which often it's not. It's often, I want to do things this way, no, you're going to do it my way. Then we need to make sure that that's not part of what we're doing. Another thing, there are 2 key dynamics that school leaders need to think about in relation to the way that they standardize their practice. One is how many decisions in the school are based on equity, which is basing a decision on each person's needs and talents, and that would mean that things are individualized, right? That it's not everybody gets the same thing. Equality is a decision where everyone gets the same thing. Equity is a decision where people are given something based on their needs and their talents, and it's individualized. That's a critical thing, and many school leaders make decisions based on equality when they should be making them on equity. It's a really dangerous trap, and it's difficult to know, but we've got to be interrogating that at all times. The other one is how much and to what extent what we're doing in school should be individualized versus being standardized. That is also another key thing. One of the trends that you're seeing now in the United States is that you're seeing there are laws in place to make sure that there are individualized education plans for students with disabilities. But there's now a trend through different things like response to intervention and different kinds of things to develop individualized education plans for every student in the school. And this, I think, there's problems with that, but it's definitely a good step in the right direction to start acknowledging that we're teaching individual people here, not just globs of educational matter. There's another thing that we have going on in education. There are two other points that are undermining the field. One of them is an abundance of Pollyanna language, and the other one has to do with entrepreneurialism. Now, by Pollyanna language, what I'm talking about is, have any of you met those leaders or worked with those leaders where everything's great, everything's amazing, my school is the greatest thing ever, we're going to do this, vision, mission, all this kind of stuff. You know those kind of people, right? And nothing's ever bad, and everything's just an opportunity waiting to happen, and all that kind of stuff. Well, you know, that's fine to be positive, and we don't want to come to school and be filled with doom and gloom or anything like that. But what we don't want to do is come in and just whitewash over issues to the point where we're ignoring them. And that's one of the dangers. I'll talk about it more in a second here. One of the dangers if we speak about schools that kind of way. Another thing that we need to think about in terms of the way that knowledge is happening in schools is that a lot of what's happening in schools right now, there's a really big not court case, I wish it was a court case, but thing that's happening in Texas where Texas drives a lot of the way that content that's in textbooks because Texas and California are basically the two biggest markets. So if things are going to sell in Texas and California, the publishing houses make stuff for them, and then every other state is just sort of left to pick up the pieces and use whatever was made there. Well, Texas is now pushing through a rewriting of history. I don't know if this has made the news much over here, but that includes, for example, because of the recent controversy we've had in the United States around the Confederate flag, it's going to teach that the main reason for the Civil War was not slavery, that it was actually states' rights. Okay? And so that's potentially changing the entire future of the way that history is taught in the United States based on what? Based on money, right? Based on neoliberal types of market-driven ideas about education, not about what we know, not about what's good pedagogy, not about knowledge, not about teaching, not about any of that. Okay? There are many snake oil salespeople. I don't know if that term really translates here. Okay? All right. But there are many snake oil salespeople in education. They're selling the latest program, they're selling the latest book. This is going to save your school. I know how to do this. Here are the 3 things that if your teachers do, everything's going to be amazing. There's a lot of this kind of reductionist, quick fix type of approaches to education, and that's killing the field. And education leadership is a particular target. Why? Because school leaders are in charge of budgets. And school leaders are in positions of influence to get those materials out widely. So one of the things you see in a lot of educational leadership, have any of you, has this ever happened in any of the schools you've been to? Administrator goes off to a conference. Administrator comes back from conference. We're doing everything new. I've got these new materials, these new ideas. Where'd they come from? Well, we have to buy them. It's pretty common, right? Okay? We have to be aware of these kinds of things because what we're doing in schools needs to be research-based. It needs to be up to speed. It needs to be context relevant. It needs to be all of these kinds of things that we sometimes overlook when we're just buying the new thing. The other thing is that if you look back over the educational leadership materials, literature, over the past 75 years or so, you're going to see a lot of the same ideas repackaged with new names. One of the things that I've studied school reform a lot, and so I've studied lots of the trends and you know, things that happen. One of the things that was really eye-opening to me was seeing something that was really big in the early 70s in the United States called mastery learning. Okay, it's an approach to teaching, and it's like, it's basically, you know, you master this skill, you move on to the next, and so this kind of thing. There's constant assessment, all that kind of stuff. That came back in the 80s, repackaged as several different reform movements. It came back also again in the 90s, packaged as a couple of other reform movements. There's no good research base to back up any of it. You know, there's bits and pieces here and there. But if you pay attention and you keep up on the history of education and you look for these kinds of trends, they're out there. And a lot of times when people are coming and talking to you about the latest, greatest practices, they're not necessarily anything new. It's worth keeping up on your history lest we repeat the mistakes of the past. The other thing is that there's a particular language that people who are education leaders are taught. Mostly when you're a teacher, you don't hear the words vision and mission and aims and goals and strategic planning and all of this kind of stuff. You don't hear that until people start becoming administrators. And then you ever wonder when you see a teacher become an administrator, sometimes they start speaking a different language, you know, and they're making, now part of that is because these terms help them look at the school in a different way. They're helpful, they really are. And they're potentially incredibly powerful tools for positive improvement in schools. A good vision and mission process in the hands of capable leadership is one of the most powerful things that an organization can ever have. But how many of you have worked in an organization where there was a vision and you didn't know what it is? Or you didn't get to have any input on what it was? Or it was in the wall in the conference room, but you know, that was pretty much it. Or you talked about it at the retreat 3 years ago and never heard about it again. These kinds of things become barriers to improvement rather than bridges to improved practice. And so it's important that when educational leaders are practicing, that they make sure that what they're doing is communicating in the same language in which teachers speak. One of the things that a principal I worked with a few years ago said to me that was really powerful was he just said that I'll listen to anybody who has ideas about reform or school improvement, but if they're not going to be there day to day to do it with us, I don't have any use for them. We have to make it ours. Our ideas have to be the ones that carry the day. Partially that's because of the language that we have in our school and the way that we interact with each other. Now, as I was saying before too, one of the things that we have to do, and this is where accountability can potentially be helpful, is that we have to make sure that the way that we're communicating with each other, the way that we're talking about schools, the things that we're looking at are not only accentuating the positive and trying to hide the negative. This is unprofessional. It's not going to help anybody. It's also actually the way that a lot of inequity happens in schools. That school leaders will emphasize, oh, we have this happening, we have that happening, we have this happening. Oh, but we're not going to talk about what's happening to those kids who are learning English as a second language. We're not, I don't know much about that, but look at this other great stuff we're doing. That's one of the things that we've got to help eradicate. One of the things that we've got to think about are what are the agendas of the school? What's in that agenda and what's not in that agenda? And often, if you look at it very carefully, what you're seeing is you're seeing things that would be positive no matter who the leader was at the top of the agenda, and then you're seeing things that, that have to do with equity that are disadvantaging some people low on the agenda. And a good leader will flip that list and put the most difficult things at the top. Wow, I've already talked for 30 minutes. Danger of putting a professor up here. Okay. Another point that's worth making is that too many things that happen in schools are done for the edification of adults rather than the education of students. Now let's think about that for a minute. One of the things that, here's some of the kinds of questions that we need to think about when we're talking about what we do in schools. Are the process and outcomes in the school student-centered or educator-centered? There are so many times when you hear teachers talk about, well, that's the way I do it. That's what I teach. That's what I do. When they need to be talking about, that's how that kid learns. This is what's going to help produce this outcome. Sharing ideas like that. There's a different language when you are in a school that's student-centered versus one that's adult-centered. It's a critical thing to pay attention to. Often decisions that should be based on pedagogy, on content, on different kinds of instructional reasons are made because of convenience. That person's taught that for 25 years, we're just going to let them go. They're going to retire in 4 or 5 years. What happens during those 4 or 5 years? That's when students' whole time in the school, right? That's unethical practice. All right, we've got to be making sure that the decisions we're making are student-centered. And the thing is, too, that for educational leaders and those of you in leadership positions in this room, having a student-centered approach is the number one thing that will help you have difficult conversations with people in schools. If you always bring it back to, it's about the kids, it's about the students, then all of a sudden arguments like, well, I've always had that classroom, I've always taught during that period, sound pretty thin when you start putting good rationales for student-centered education at the fore. We have to be thinking about, one of the other things too, is that we can't be working in schools where we talk about a divide between research and practice. Good teaching is research. All the word research means is to look again. All good teachers do is look at their practice, they reflect on it, they gather data on it, they know what their students are doing, they change their practice based on what's happening, they're constantly looking for new ways. That's good research, that's good teaching, that's good leadership as well. The important thing too is that we're both conducting research, that we're looking again, that we're being reflective practitioners, that we're being critical of the processes and the outcomes that the school is producing in our own school, but that we're also learning from the global schoolhouse, if you will. That we're reading the research, that we're up on the latest things that people are doing, not just down the road, but one of the wonderful things that's happened in the last 25 years is the way that the internet and different kinds of things have allowed us to look at what's happening in countries that are doing things differently, in helping share ideas between the US and Australia and Japan and Korea and Hong Kong and some of these Finland, some of these countries that have really amazing and interesting things going on. So we need to be making sure that we're both doing research in our schools and also being in touch with the research that's being done in other places. It's also important to consider where students' voices are in schools and where they're absent. This can be a really critical and important piece of leadership. When leadership decisions are being made, how many times is it 4 or 5 adults in a closed room sitting there making huge decisions that are going to impact students, and they have no chance to have any input on it whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying students drive every decision in schools, but the input from students, respecting students as intelligent, competent people who have some kind of agency in the direction of their lives is critical. These are one of the things that the better administrators that I've worked with over time done is, where do you see them? Do you see them sequestered in their office, doing papers all day? No. A lot of the best principals I've worked with are in the hallways, in the classrooms, talking to the kids. They know what's going on. They're able to engage with people on that kind of level. It's critical if we're going to actually make sure that education makes a difference in people's lives. Another thing that we have to do, which is also related to the individualization and standardization argument, is that we have to be champions of creativity rather than conformity in our schools. One of the amazing things about schools that makes them different from every other organization just about is that they're filled with brilliant and insightful people. That makes them fundamentally different kinds of organizations than almost every other organization. There is so much expertise behind every doorway in a school. But we have to make sure that we're encouraging that the creativity, the insights, the knowledge, the experience that we have in schools, and make sure that we're putting in place the kinds of structures and processes that help people get together and share their insights and their ideas and experiment with new kinds of things and get together with people and talk about ideas. When we have schools that encourage creativity, we have places of constant renewal. We have places where people are always sharing ideas, where they're not competing with each other, where they're trying to help pull each other up. But schools that are in a conformity mode, schools where everyone is treated the same, where conversations are silenced or not even made space, there's no space to have them. These are the kind of places where people get burnt out, where they feel alienated, where teaching becomes something they didn't expect or want. So one of the things that we have to do, and this is counter to the ways that a lot of educational leaders think, is that we have to create cultures of conflict rather than complicity in our schools. And what I mean by that is one of the great foundations we have of a lot of our ideas about schooling is that they should be democratic in nature, that there should be ideas, people should share them, they should be debated, things should go forward. I guarantee you democracy is, you all know very well, is not a system that shies away from conflict. It's one that encourages conflict. It's one that demands it. It's one that means that people should be able to share ideas that are different. I see it this way, you see it this way, and get it out in the open, and that's a healthy, normal, and expected part of moving the organization forward. And the people aren't scared of getting their ideas out there. One of the other critiques that I would have of educational leadership as a field is that educational leadership is borrowed too heavily and too uncritically from business literature, not enough from the social sciences and other fields of education, and it's really highly under-theorized in whole. That's pretty gently put, isn't it? Okay. So there's nothing wrong with getting ideas from anywhere. There's nothing wrong with ideas from business coming to the field of education. What there is a problem with is taking them uncritically and not adapting them to the special things that happen in schools, right? One of the classic examples of this is strategic planning. Do any of you work in organizations that engage now in strategic planning? Okay. Strategic planning was an idea that really came into the business field in the 60s and 70s, really had its heyday, and then it died a terrible death because it spent lots of money, lots of time, and didn't really help organizations move forward. There's a fantastic book by a scholar named Mintzberg called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning, and it talks about how it uses it as an example of in education. We take sort of these ideas and then we latch onto them and we just do them. And we keep doing them. And we keep doing them. Even when they've been proven not to work. Even when we look at our schools and think, well, hang on, our school isn't really much better than it was 5 years ago, even though we had this 5-year strategic plan. What's going on? There are reasons embedded in those processes that they don't work. But we keep moving uncritically forward. That's just a basic example of why things don't work like that, borrowing them lock, stock, and barrel from education. The other thing is that in a very simple way, we don't produce things in education. We don't. We help facilitate learning. We are part in a long arc of each student's lifelong learning. We're like that much of it, when we talk about formal education in schools. And then when we think about it as a bigger continuum, we have them for this precious little bit of time, and we have a chance to really make a difference. But if we're thinking about it just in terms of percentages and quartiles on tests and getting people to a certain outcome, and we're not thinking of it as a more holistic process, then what we end up doing in many cases, and there's quite a bit of research to back this up, is school becomes what? A soul-crushing experience for a lot of kids, right? It really destroys their love of learning. It is very reductionist when we treat them only as sort of things that are there to produce test scores that we need so our school looks good. We need to make sure that we're looking at people in a holistic manner. Now, many of you may have heard this little anecdote, but it's a story based on a true story where a CEO of a corporation that made ice cream came to be the principal of a school. retired from being business head. And they said, oh, this person, they were a great leader, they were wonderful in business, so we're going to bring them to the school. And the leader, the CEO came in and said, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do the other. And one of the teachers raised their hand and said, Mr. CEO, what did you, you made some amazing ice cream, didn't you? Oh yeah, we made the best stuff out there. Well, what did how did that work? What would happen if you're making your ice cream and a batch of blueberries came in that wasn't up to your standards? Oh, we'd throw it out, we'd get new ones, we'd start over, and we'd only have the highest standards. And the teacher said, as you might already be predicting or may have heard before, we can't toss out our blueberries. Our blueberries are students, and we're making ice cream with whatever comes to us. Okay? You cannot just accept business strategies as a way to run schools and to practice education. There is nothing wrong with gaining inspiration and ideas from those fields, but they must be adapted to suit the special qualities of learning and instruction that we have in schools. Educational leadership, one of the things that's always amazed me too, is that our research so seldom connects. My office is on the third floor, wherever it is, over there, in the Faculty of Education. All up and down the hall, I've got brilliant teacher education people. I've only been here since January, so I haven't met most of them. But these are the connections that we should be making in our curriculum. Educational leadership people need to be working with curriculum people, with primary school people, with secondary school people. Ours is in many ways an incomplete field. We can bring the organizational ideas. We can bring the different kinds of things. And we know how to empower people. We know how to do research that critically interrogates structures and organizational culture and lots of those kinds of things. But to really reach its potential, educational leadership research is going to have to connect to people with expertise in adult learning, in primary school education, secondary school education, science, mathematics, all of those different reading, all of those kinds of different content areas, because it's going to only be through those meaningful relationships that we actually get to the potential of educational leadership research going beyond just structures and processes and really connecting deeply to learning. Another thing, and this has been really striking to me since I've been here in Australia, is education is going to work best when we have open systems of cooperation and not closed systems of competition. One of the things that's, to be fair, made me pretty sad since I've been here is seeing how much schools are in competition with each other for students, for test scores, for this, for that, for the other. When, remember what I said earlier about how schools are filled with brilliant people? Well, multiply that by 2, by 4, by 10, by 20, by 100, and that's the potential you have in a city like Melbourne. But if the schools are in competition with one another, if they have a built-in incentive to not share ideas, to not work together, to say our school is better than your school, and all of those kinds of things, then we're absolutely shooting ourselves in the foot as an educational system. And so one of the ways that we know that we can possibly move forward better is by making sure that we work together. And I would put it to you, it's pretty dramatically put in that slide, but I feel this very strongly. Competing against each other in education is stealing resources from children. Let that sink in for a second. If we have set up systems that put us all in competition with each other to the point that I know how to teach this chemistry lesson really well, but there's no way I'm sharing it with those schools down the road because I want my scores to be the best. What a failure our system is. I mean, that's crazy, So we've got to rethink this sort of competitive, market-driven, neoliberal perspective we have on schooling, both at the, you hear those terms bandied about at the global level, but this is happening in our backyard, and it's preventing our students and our children from having the kind of education they could have based on people that live within a kilometer of each other, that work right down the hall from each other. We've got to rethink that. one of the things to think about in respect to that is that every school, classroom, every teacher, we're constantly having ongoing creative experimentations in how to teach, how kids learn. We're trying to figure out what's working, what's not working, all of those kinds of things. Okay, I already said that. And I would put it to us that as educators, we have an ethical and moral obligation to our students and to our profession to transcend these kind of competitive boundaries that are put in our way. We've got to figure out ways, if the system is going to remain competitive, we've got to figure out ways to share ideas regardless. Because there's nothing fruitful is going to come from this school winning or this school being the top ranks. Come on. That isn't what we're about. We're about educating several 100,000 students in a city like this, a country like this, yet we're putting it where we have that potential, but we've chosen a system where we choose to educate only 100 students or so at a time, a couple hundred here, a couple thousand here, because we're in that school and you're in that school. If we rethink the way that we approach these kinds of ideas, we have tremendous potential. And of course, education is not school. Education is much bigger than school. Students learn so much at home, in their communities, in lots of different other kinds of activities that they're engaging in. So we can't just think about schools as sort of this closed little system anymore. We're starting to see some really amazing things that people are doing, some with technology, but others just with cooperation and different kinds of things, bringing in new ideas, bringing in new practices. One of the most amazing things, the most amazing technological innovation I've seen in my lifetime with regard to education are some of the things that teachers are now able to do with students who have autism, with iPads and different kinds of things, where you see students come to life who just have not had that kind of outlet or engagement anymore. And that's just one tiny little example of an amazing innovation that if we're not sharing these kinds of things, if we're not doing our bit to make sure that the people around us, the people in our communities, the people we can engage with are aware of the potential of these kinds of educational innovations, then what are we doing? When we discover innovation, we owe it to share. We owe it to the students. We owe it to that student who's in the next school who might benefit from that, to share what we know. You know, this one is a term some of you will already be familiar with, is difference-blind practices in education. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about treating everyone the same and acting as though people do not have different kinds of differences in schools. I do a lot of research on racism, so something that strikes really close to home for me. But discrimination and oppression around issues of sexism, racism, gender discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination, all of those kinds are real. Every social science has identified them as being real and having negative consequences for people's lives. We cannot practice leadership that ignores these kinds of dynamics. It is utterly irresponsible. So, but you still hear people in this day and age saying, oh, I don't see race. I don't see that. No, I treat every student the same. Well, treating every student the same with regard to these is for some a death sentence, is for many dooming them to an inequitable and disadvantaged educational experience. We have to have leaders who are aware of, who actively engage, and are proactive with in relation to these different kinds of issues of equity. Now that means, in part, being aware of the different type of microaggressions that happen in schools, the way that certain students are spoken to, or the different types of intended and unintended little slights that they receive. That also has to do with macroaggressions, just meaning outright violence, nasty stuff. And all of these things happen in schools, you know? I mean, we can't sit here and act like they don't. There's bullying, right? There's cyberbullying. There's all kinds of different kinds of things. There's people who never see people who look like them in the curriculum. There's people who never see a teacher or an adult in the school who look like them or have their kinds of experiences, or, or validate that their worldview matters. All of these things are important. And if we're not even paying attention to this, if we're not even aware of it, there's no way that leaders can engage with and influence these kind of dynamics in schools. And I guarantee you, leaders can influence those dynamics in schools. Absolutely. We have irrefutable is too strong. Researchers shouldn't say irrefutable. We have very compelling evidence that leaders can influence these types of practices in schools. So one of the things that we have to do is unlearn our miseducation about things. We've all been raised to assume certain things about race and class and gender, and they're often not interrogated. We don't deeply reflect on them. We don't learn about them. We don't have conversations with people about them. But if we don't do that, we're not going to learn in critical areas of social and cultural activity in the schools. We're going to have an impoverished perspective on what's going on if we're not up to date and constantly learning and paying attention to the way that these things play out in practice. This is another one that you almost never see anything about in educational leadership literature. One of the things that you hear when educational leaders come in, or when administrators in particular come into a new school, is they often say, oh, spend that first year just kind of learning about everything, right? But what they often don't do is learn anything about the history of the organization and the history of the people who are in the organization. It's really important that people take the time to understand that each organization has a different history with respect to different reforms, different ways of communicating, different ways that curriculum decisions are made, that finances are used, that resources are distributed, who's favored, who's not favored. I could keep going on and on and on. But the point is that organizations are not ahistorical. Every time you introduce a new idea as an educational leader, it happens in a historical context for each person. And so when some people, that's why, I'm sure none of you have ever done this, where a new idea is introduced and you go, we did this 3 years ago. We did this 20 years ago. Whatever. That's why it's critical that when new ideas are introduced, that when new innovations are coming into a school, that educational leaders take the time to say, has something similar like this happened in the past? Is there a precedent? Is there anything we should know about that's going to shape the way that we should deliver this? All of those kinds of things are critical. Also, it's important to remember that each person has their own history with a lot of the ideas that are happening in schools, right? That things have been introduced to them gently, things have been introduced to them rough. One of the things that we know from lots of sociology of education research is that many times when teachers are introduced with a new kind of idea or new reform or something like that, they say, okay, great, I'm just going to wait this one out. Okay, I'll fill out your little form for a year and then I know it's going to be gone next year. Why are we doing all this if it's doomed to fail? If we don't have a basic understanding of the histories of the people and the organization, then a lot of the work we do as educational leaders is going to never reach its potential. So there are three basic things that we have to think about, okay? As leaders, we want to be history informed. We want to know what the history is. Versus obviously history ignorant. And then the final type of way that people engage with history is history inert. And that means that people are paralyzed by what happened in the past. Oh, well, I tried to introduce this idea 2 years ago. It really flopped. Everybody hated me, so there's no way I'm doing that. I'm just leaving things the way they are, right? None of you ever worked in an organization like that, have you? Okay. Good for you. Okay, we're getting near the end here. Another thing that I'd push people, especially scholars thinking about these kinds of things, is that educational leadership research needs to evolve. One of the things that's curious, much like what I talked about with distributed leadership not really being an educational theory but a leadership theory, It's very same when you come to the research methods that we typically use in educational leadership research. Almost none of it accounts for actual leadership dynamics. When you look at the methods that are used, they're often classic social science, quantitative or qualitative research methods. They don't account for issues like, okay, if I'm going to do an interview-based study, they don't account for, okay, my gatekeeper into the school was the principal. That's going to shape the way some people talk to me, right? In some schools it will, right? We don't account for these kinds of power dynamics that happen between people. Leadership, as we talked about before, is essentially a relational activity. Yet we almost never talk about what's the relationship, the complicated relationship between the researcher and the subjects in the study, or the types of limitations we may have for a quantitative data set given the type of ways that it was administered, because lots of quantitative research doesn't really even get at actual leadership types of phenomenon. And it doesn't look at how things improve or evolve, because leadership in and of itself is based on change. That's why, a lot of longitudinal studies are really helpful in educational leadership. A lot of snapshot types of quantitative research is not. So one of the things that we need to do is rethink a lot of the research designs, the data collection techniques we use, the data analysis procedures, to take into account the dynamic, the relational, the special types of things that leadership demands that we do if we're really going to be studying leadership and connecting it to learning. Now, so what's happened in the last decade or so is that there's been this real excitement about mixed methods. That's fine. Mixed methods is great. It will actually help us better answer a lot of educational leadership research questions. But at the same time, so will just better done quantitative and qualitative research and conceptual research and philosophical research and all of these different kinds of things. We need in educational leadership a real explosion of high-level research from many different perspectives, challenging many different orthodoxies of the field. So in summation, and trying to think of a couple of ways, maybe take-home kind of points about where we go next, we have got to develop an educational leadership that emphasizes education and puts it more in balance with the concepts of leadership that have been running rampant in the field for the last 100 years. We've got to get learning, student learning, especially at the heart of what we're looking at. Most educational leadership studies, if you read them, are studies of principals and teachers. Missing somebody there? Okay? We've got to push ourselves to get in there. One of the things too, that taking something like distributed leadership that supposedly looks at how leaders and followers interact in an organization, guess who is never included in distributed leadership studies? Why do we not know how peers lead their peers? Why are we not talking about and investigating things about how the way that, let's say a topic that's really important right now, what happens to girls' love of science from about grade 6 to about grade 9? Something happens there that is making a lot of girls lose interest in going into science-related careers. Why are we not looking at the way that students are influencing their peers through different leadership activities in making their decisions, in having their kind of thoughts and feelings about those kinds of things? We have nothing in leadership research. There is some good scholarship on that. But I think that there's a lot of potential for answering some of these difficult questions that educational leadership hasn't even taken on as a field. The other thing is that educational leadership as a field has got to get over its love of lists. It has got to get beyond, these are the top 10 things, these are the 5 things effective leaders do, yada, yada, yada. It is never that simple. And going about it and explaining it to people in a reductionist, this is easy, why don't you just do this kind of way, might sell a lot of books, but it's not improving a lot of education. We've got to move toward the kinds of thinking that adds complexity, not the kind of things that embrace simplicity. Now, it is really tempting, and there was some great research by an anthropologist in the 70s named Harry Walcott, who talked a lot about how one of the things that, one of the big problems, classic problems in education leadership, is that leaders always have to be doing something. They always have to be moving, doing something, changing something, rather than sometimes letting something play out and develop. We actually know through pretty good school reform research that it usually takes about 3 years for a new practice to come into place and really become a new part of what's going on in a school. But since school leaders are under immense pressure to change everything every year, every few months, to show that they're doing this, that they've got 19 programs in place to address this one problem in the school, then we're never really going to get there in terms of really deeply exploring, really discovering, really taking the time to look again at our practices, to look at what the research might be able to tell us from outside, to look at what the research that we're doing within might be able to tell us. We've got to make sure that we're putting processes in place that allow best practices in a given context to be developed. We've also got to be thinking about ways that research can be communicated quickly in an accessible language. Lots of I guarantee you, there's a lot of amazing high-level educational leadership research that none of you will ever read because it's in these journals that are full of even more jargon than I threw at you tonight, and I tried not to. But we've got to be careful and make sure that we're moving forward in ways that actually encourage communication, because what does the co in communication mean? Together. Communication is about output and it's about intake. And if we're only thinking about one half of that, we're not communicating. So one of the things we have is, as I was saying, we need school-based folks doing research, whether it's like research of practice. I'm not saying necessarily highly sophisticated, kinds of things that people like me might do. But we need people doing research and from the university side, from the school side, sharing their ideas. When I say getting in touch with research, I don't mean people in schools need to go read the journals. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's got to be two-way. There has to be an attempt at communication that's more earnest and more useful and better thought out than what we're doing right now. Okay, so to conclude, let's revisit the title of this presentation, right? So is everything we know about educational leadership wrong? I actually posted on Facebook the title of this presentation, and about 10 of my friends who are educational scholars from around the world wrote, "Everything?" Yeah, no. I would say that there's been a lot of wonderful research done in educational leadership over the past 75 years. What I would also say is that almost all of it misses the mark, because it's not about education. It's about leadership. It's about organizational efficiency. It's about different kinds of processes, different kinds of structures, and it just doesn't take that next step of connecting to learning. And so if I could say anything, and the reason that I still stand by the title of this presentation is that we've got to question and critically interrogate our assumptions about learning, our assumptions about leadership, the connection between them, and get serious about studying learning and instruction and the way those connect to leadership activities in schools on a level and in a way that we have never done before. And with that, I'll stop.